genuinely may float into space with the amount of excitement that I feel right now. So this is part one of my learning to sew series, but if you're just here to learn about like the equipment and tools that I recommend, you're still in the right place. You don't necessarily have to watch all the other parts. But if you are a beginner in your sewing journey, this is a great place to start, because before you can do anything, you do need to learn about your tools and equipment, what things you absolutely have to have, what things are just nice to have, what brands I recommend. We're gonna go through all that stuff. Sewing is something that genuinely has changed my life, and not just from like a career standpoint, because it's something I do as my job and have done it as my job for a long time, but even sewing just for fun, I personally feel like has just built my confidence as a person, and it's something that I care about so much when other people want to learn to sew. I want to just like take them under my wing and tell them everything I know and hug them and cheer them on. So that's what we're gonna be doing today. If you feel overwhelmed at all about sewing in general, you're gonna be fine. You are going to be sewing so many cute things before you know it. So don't be nervous at all, I got you. So in the rest of the Learning to Sew series, I'm going to be talking about fabric, everything you need to know about fabric, what things to buy, what fabrics are good for different projects, how to shop for fabric. We're gonna do like a shop along. I'm gonna take you with me as I shop for fabric. We're gonna learn about grain lines and how to cut your fabric. It's gonna be great. And then I'll also be doing a video about using your machine. So once you unbox it, what all of the little pieces are, how to use them. I'm gonna walk you through everything. And then we'll also be talking about patterns. What is a pattern? I didn't use patterns for many years, like probably the first 9 years that I sewed, because they seemed scary to me, and now I'm not scared at all. So I'm gonna guide you through what patterns are, how to use them, how to pick a good pattern, what all the markings mean, and then I'll also be walking you through your like first beginner project, something super duper easy that you won't need a pattern for. It'll just be probably rectangles. Could be a tote bag, I haven't 100% decided. But we'll do something cute and super easy to kind of set you on your journey. But all of those things we're going to talk about can be completely standalone. So if you just want to jump into the ones that you want to watch, absolutely feel free to do that. Same with this one. If you just want to hear about tools and equipment, that's all we're talking about today. Also, I'm approaching this conversation as if you were like a very, very new beginner. So if I'm like mansplaining anything about sewing to you, I apologize, please forgive me. I would just rather assume that you know nothing instead of leaving anything out. Okay, so as far as sewing tools, I've been sewing for about 10 years and I'm self-taught. So everything that I'm going to recommend to you is not from a perspective of like, I'm this super professional that was trained at fashion school or whatever. It's just the things that I use all the time that I feel like are helpful. And even when I started, I got like a little kit of like beginner sewing stuff. A lot of it I did use, but there were definitely a few things in there that I have never used. So I'm not gonna recommend anything to you guys that is superfluous, but at the same time, other people might have different opinions of what is necessary and not. I also am going to have everything I'm talking about today linked in the description. I've linked it all through Amazon because Amazon makes things very easy to link lists of things. But if it's in your budget, I would recommend to kind of make a list of all the things you wanna get from this video, and then go to your local like fabric or craft store and see how many of the things you can get there. And then anything that you couldn't find there, you could order on Amazon or wherever you wanna get it. So don't feel like you have to necessarily order exactly the things that I posted in my links, because I just know so many like small business fabric store owners who are amazing and would definitely be super helpful if you went in and got your stuff from them. But I also certainly won't judge you if you decide to just make it easier on yourself and order from Amazon. Okay, the first thing is probably not going to surprise you. Tool number one that you absolutely have to have is a sewing machine. I actually do get comments from people asking me if they can sew by hand instead. And I guess you can, right? Like in the olden days, everything was sewn by hand before machines were invented. But even if you're learning out, like absolutely, I think you need a machine. I just think sewing by hand seems like a completely different skill at this point. But if you are hesitant to buy a machine, they are like a bit of an investment, but again, I think it's your number one most necessary item. If you're hesitant to purchase one, you could look to borrow one from a friend or family member. I know some libraries loan out sewing machines, so you could look into your library to see if they offer that. Just while you're trying it out, and then once you decide like, yes, you do want to pursue sewing as a hobby, you could purchase one. Or I know a lot of people also recommend thrifting machines, like looking on Facebook Marketplace or going to thrift stores. I think that route could be a bit overwhelming, especially if you've never sewn before. You might not know what to look for. You also don't know, purchasing from someone else, if it comes with everything it originally came with, or if you have any problems or issues while you're sewing. It would be hard to diagnose if there's an issue with what you are doing as a beginner or with the actual machine. So Like I said, my recommendation would be buying a machine, but absolutely feel free to do whatever you feel comfortable with. And with that said, I don't think you need an expensive one at all. I think there's just a couple things you should look for, and basically all modern machines have them. I think you want a machine that has several stitches and sewing feet, and not even a lot, but just a few. These are the ones that I would look for. So as far as stitches, there's like your normal straight stitch. Any machine's going to do that. A zigzag stitch, which again, all modern machines do a zigzag stitch. There are some older ones where you just adjust like the width of your stitch, I think, that makes it a zigzag. You definitely can still work with that, but I feel like having a zigzag stitch does make life easier as a beginner. And then two other stitches I would look for is an overlocking or overcast stitch. And we'll get into that all when I talk about the actual machine, so don't worry about it too much yet. But basically that's going to finish off your raw edges. So anytime you have like a seam, like a side seam, for example. In fact, let me go get an example. Okay, so this is a dress I made. This is an inside side seam of a skirt. And any garment of clothing that you're wearing will have this too. So you can like look inside your shirt right now. Anytime you sew two pieces of fabric together, you need to finish the raw edge. And if you're following like a pattern or tutorial or whatever, they'll tell you how to do this. But just kind of to give you a frame of reference, I finish all my raw edges with a serger, which we'll get to in a second. But it basically looks like this, where you can see there's this like locked edge, right? That's not just like a single stitch from your machine. There's these stitches that lock around the edge to seal it off so there's nothing fraying, okay? Don't stress too much about that. We'll get to that later. But essentially, there are multiple ways to finish your edges. And again, we will walk through them. I finished mine with a serger, which is a separate machine, but a lot of modern sewing machines have stitches and functions in them that do an overlocking or overcasting stitch. And there's a separate sewing machine foot and stitch that does that. So I would look for those in your machine. You can also finish your edges with a zigzag stitch. It's just a bit messier looking. So completely up to you. That's probably not like a 100% necessary, but I feel like it's like a 95% necessary. And then the other stitch and foot to look for is buttons and buttonholes. Even if you don't think you're going to be making a lot of garments with buttons, I still feel like I use buttonholes frequently in garments. Like if you're making something with a drawstring, or like even if you're tying straps and you want to like make a hole for the strap to lead through, I think buttonholes are something that is very, very, very nice to have the functionality for. And I think you'll be kicking yourself if you don't get that. And I know there are ways you can kind of hodgepodge your own buttonhole with a machine that doesn't necessarily do it. But again, so many modern machines, cheap modern machines, have buttonhole settings that I feel like you might as well just get one. Okay, so straight stitch, zigzag stitch, overlocking or overcasting stitch, which has a separate foot as well for your sewing machine, and then a button and buttonhole stitch and foot that's separate. And then the last thing that I think is maybe more of a nice to have but not necessary to have, there's a foot called a walking foot that you can attach to your sewing machine. I would say some modern machines have them, some don't. So that's why it's not like super necessary. Like if you find a machine you really like at a price you really like, but it doesn't have a walking foot, you'll probably be fine. But essentially what a walking foot does is if you are quilting something or working with like a lot of knit fabrics, a walking foot feeds the fabric through the machine, not just from the bottom, because on your sewing machine there are little like feet that come up and push the fabric along from the bottom. But a walking foot also has little feet on the top, so it's pushing it through from both sides. So that's why if you're quilting something and there's like multiple layers with batting, if it's pushing from the top and bottom at the same rate, then it's going to be much smoother. Again, if that's all nonsense to you, you can skip it. It's totally fine. I just love my walking foot and I make a lot of quilted clothing, and so I find it to be extremely helpful. Also, I'm pretty sure that you can purchase a walking foot separately after, although I'm not 100% positive that all machines are compatible with a walking foot, but I'm sure if you look into it to buy a walking foot separate, it'll say wherever you're buying it from, like what machines it's compatible with. Okay, so that's what I would look for when looking for a machine. And then I have 4 recommended machine options. Again, I'm going to link them all in the description. And we're basically just gonna go Goldilocks style from the cheapest with the least amount of features to the most expensive one on the list. Also, they're all Brother brand, and that's because that's the brand that I've always used, not necessarily because an expert told me to use Brother. It's just that that was the first machine I ever bought, and I've loved them and had no issues. So I've just kept buying Brother machines. And they're like fairly cheap and super user-friendly. Okay, so the first one is the very cheapest with the smallest amount of features. That one's called, I have to read it because I can't remember, Brother XM2701. Right now that one's $128 on Amazon. It has 27 stitches and 6 different feet attachments. It would be perfectly sufficient for you to learn on, but a couple drawbacks that I feel like it has. The design is a little bit more cramped. There's just not as much space to work fabric in there. It's not computerized, which isn't like a huge deal, but the display on the machine, I've found having a computerized display is very helpful because ones with computerized displays will tell you like what foot you need for which stitch you're doing. They're just more like user-friendly. I feel like I know more of what's going on when there's that little like screen on there. So not a huge drawback, but that's one thing that I would consider. And then the other factor is there's only one speed. So like on my machine, you can set it to like slow, medium, or fast. Mine's always on fast because I've sewn so much that I'm like super used to it. But I think it's really helpful as a beginner to be able to turn your machine down to slow so that when you're first starting out, you know, if you push the pedal down, your machine's not gonna like start going super fast. So that's something to consider as well. I probably recommend something that has multiple speeds. But again, if you want to go with that machine, especially if you're like super budget conscious or whatever, you will totally be able to sew things very adequately with that machine. All right, the second machine is called the Brother CS5055. And this one is very similar to the machine that I learned on. The one I learned on has been discontinued, and I think this is just like the updated version of that one. And the way that I got my first machine is when I was engaged, or I guess dating my now husband. I had mentioned that like, oh, I'd like to learn to sew, like that seems kind of fun. And then when we were engaged, he bought me one for my birthday, like kind of out of the blue. He's just like a really good gift giver and listener. Like he listens to things that I mention and then I don't think about it again. And then it's like, surprise, I got it for you. So anyway, he bought me that one. Right now it's $150 on Amazon. I feel like at the time that was 12 years ago. It was probably only like $130 or something. It's just gone up over time. But it's a very basic machine. I learned on it. I even had like a handmade kids clothing business that I did for a long time, like using that machine. So you'll definitely be able to sew whatever you want to sew on it. It's slightly more expensive than the first one I talked about, and it does have a few more features. So that one has 60 stitches and 7 feet attachments. It does have a little computerized display, but it is only 1 speed, which the one that I learned on, I swear had 3 speeds, but I guess the new like updated version of it just has the 1 speed. So that's maybe like the biggest drawback I would see to that one. And then the third option is the Brother CS7000X. I don't know why I can't remember these short, simple names. So that one's a little bit more expensive. It's $240 on Amazon right now because it does have a few more features. But honestly, out of those 3 that I've just listed that are like pretty cheap-ish, beginner friendly, if it were me starting out now, or like my best friend or whatever, I would probably say to get that one because I feel like the few extra features it does have is really worth it. Again, you can get whatever machine you want to, but this one has 70 stitches and 10 feet. This was the only one so far that I've talked about that has a walking foot, which I feel like is very helpful. And it also has an extended table. So you'll see, like, you can look in the Amazon listing, but there's like this extra attachment thing that slides onto the machine that just gives you a bit of an extra flat surface. In fact, I think the machine that I have now, which I bought secondhand, I think that mine probably came with that. And because I bought it used, didn't have it anymore, but I so wish that I had an extended table. I would use it all the time. So that's super helpful. And then this one does have multi-speed, which I think is super important. So you can look through the listings. There's like a bunch of features. I could probably talk about this forever, but between those 3, if you're like a brand new beginner, I would recommend the third one. And then my second choice would be the second one. And then the fourth machine that I have on the list is the Brother Innov-is, I think that's how you say it, NS80E. And that is, as far as I can tell, the current version of the machine that I have now. So like I said, I bought mine used and it's like discontinued. They don't sell it anymore. Mine is the Innov-is 40E and it was like a special Project Runway edition. It had a sticker on it that said that and I peeled it off, even though I love Project Runway. But I've had this machine for years. In fact, the only reason that I got it, so like I said, my husband got me that machine like 12 years ago. I started a business with that machine. I sewed with it way too much, like 80 hours a week probably. It was crazy. And my very first machine, I took it to like a fair or something like that when I was selling like at a market or something. And when my husband was loading it out of the car after, he dropped it on the driveway and it like broke for real. So I had to get another one after that, and I just replaced it with the exact same model that I started with and used that one for several years. And then that one just completely died on me because, like I said, it's a very simple beginner machine and I genuinely used it 80 hours a week. So I took that one in to get fixed in like a sewing machine shop. They were super, super nice, but she was like, yeah, this one's gonna be more than it's worth to fix, and you sew like how much? So when I told her like what I was doing for work, how often I sewed, she's like, you absolutely need something more heavy duty. So she sold me my machine that I have now. It was used at the time. I think I got it for like $400 used. And the new updated version on Amazon, I think is $600. So yeah, definitely more than you would need as a beginner. But if you're looking for like an upgrade or something, I really like my machine. So if you've had like an old beginner beater machine for a long time, you're looking for a new one, I like mine a lot. And this one in the listing has 80 stitches and 12 feet. It's super spacious. And it also says in the listing that the parts are aluminum instead of metal. Like all the other ones say metal, this one says aluminum. Obviously, I'm pretty sure aluminum is a metal, which must just mean that the metal is better. But hopefully with all that information, you're able to pick a starter machine and kind of know what things to look for. I do also want to talk about sergers, which is a type of sewing machine. The main thing that a serger does is that overlocking stitch that I showed you earlier. It does a few other things as well. Nothing that I really use it for though, to be honest. I only use mine to overlock my edges, which sounds like something like, why would you need a whole machine just to do one thing? But genuinely, I use mine all the time. It saves me so much time and I love it. But with that being said, it is something that is nice to have and not a must have, because you can use your regular sewing machine to finish your edges. It's just gonna come out a little bit wonkier, not as nice looking, and it takes longer to do it that way, but you absolutely can. I think if you're wanting to get a serger, I would first get a few projects under your belt for two reasons. One, so that you can like ensure that you really have caught the sewing bug. I have every faith that that is going to happen because it's addictive, but I would probably want to make sure that you you want to continue with the hobby before you make that investment, because sergers are more expensive. And then also I think it would be valuable just to feel super, super, super confident with the machine that you use already before you start using a serger, because sergers are slightly more complicated to use. Really, they're just more complicated to thread. And when I do my video about using your sewing machine, I'll also have a bit in there about using your serger as well, how to thread it and use it and all that. So it really isn't as scary and intimidating as it might seem. But I think if you were a beginner and you still weren't like 100% confident with your regular machine yet, a serger would probably throw you into a tailspin. So with that being said, the serger that I have is the Brother 1034D, currently $300 on Amazon. So it is more expensive than like the beginner sewing machines. But I actually got mine used on Amazon. It's another one that I had mentioned to my husband and he bought me as a Christmas present. And I've had the same one, I think it's been like 8 or 9 years. I have the same one that he bought me on Amazon used, and I've had zero issues with it. Sorry, it's over there. I'm like gazing longingly at it. So yeah, that's something to consider, but certainly not required. Okay, now that we've talked about machines and sergers and all of the big stuff, I have a number of small little things that I use all the time. So something that you'll definitely need are pins. Can you see my pin? Let's see if I can get it to focus on the pin. Here's a little pin. So you need something to stick together your fabric when you sew it, right? Because you'll have like 2 panels of fabric. We're sticking them together with thread. That's all sewing is, really. So to get those things to stay in place before we actually put them through the machine, you're going to need to pin stuff. Again, I'm sorry if I'm mansplaining things to you, but you'll need pins. The ones I've linked, the only difference, like you can get pins anywhere, but the only difference between the ones that I've linked and like your standard pin is that I like ones that are slightly longer. From what I gather, standard pins are 1 1/4 inch long about, which is what this yellow one is. And I like to use ones that are 1.5 inches long, which is like, that's a 1/4 inch difference. Does it really matter? To me, I feel like it does make a difference. I think there are lots of times when the shorter ones, I just wish that I had a little more length to it, because you know, you put it down in the fabric and back out. So that extra 1/4 inch to me makes a difference. Also, all of the pins that I use now are white. So they're all white and they're all 1.5 inches. The yellow one I have is from probably like the first kit of pins that I ever got, but I just prefer, I've lost basically all of those. And so when I rebought pins, I got them all white, and it just makes me happy that they're all the same color. Also, am I losing my voice? I'm sorry if I sound scratchy. So an alternative to pins are necessary, I would say. Requirement. They're also not super expensive. But an alternative to pins that I also use in addition is clips. Again, I don't know if this is gonna focus on the clips, but it's basically like a little teeny chip bag clip, right? And I use both of them depending on what I'm sticking together. So I typically use pins for like bigger pieces of fabric or like just 2 flat pieces of fabric together. But these clips are technically called binding clips, and they're very helpful for the binding of garments. So like this neckline here is a binding piece, and when you're attaching, like it's basically like folded over on top of this other piece of fabric, right? This like little strip here. Those types of things is hard to get a pin in and out of it again, like in 2 places, because it's such a small place that's thick. So for elements like that, the clips are insanely helpful. You can kind of clip something in place instead of having to pin it. I know a lot of people that exclusively use clips. I still feel like there are some times where I prefer pins, which is why I use both. But the clips are also super helpful for a lot of things. So I would say these are a nice to have. They're not a necessary to have, but they're also not super expensive, and I really like mine. So the ones I have linked are not these red ones exactly. The red ones I got at Joann because I wanted to try out clips like in a pinch and I didn't want to wait for shipping. And the pack that I got was actually super expensive at Joann. And the ones I've linked are much cheaper, but I bought them just to make sure they're the same. And they are, like, they're the exact same. They have the exact same like tension. They're just multicolored instead of all being red. Like all of the ones I typically use are red, and then if I run out of these ones, I use the multicolored ones that are linked. And then with your pins, you need a pin cushion of some sort. I kind of feel like that's necessary. The pins will come in like a little plastic tray, and it's just kind of hard to fish them out from that plastic tray, and you're gonna get like poked and stuff. Also, pin cushions are also not insanely expensive, so I would get something to hold your pins in. The pin cushion I use is also a bracelet, and this one I got probably 8 years ago, and it's my favorite thing ever because you just slip it on your hand and then it's like with you as you're moving around the room and switching machines and whatever. My pin cushion's like always on my arm, but because this one's so old, it's like the elastic, it's supposed to stay right here, right? But my elastic's all stretched out. I actually want to try making my own because all of the options I found of these like wrist pin cushions, I don't like love the fabric on them, which is like, is that a huge deal? No, it's fine. But I have so many cute fabrics, I feel like I could make one. So I'm gonna try that in the future at some point. So I just stick my pins in here, but you can also get a pin cushion that is not a bracelet if you don't want to wear it, although I don't understand why you wouldn't. It's like the best thing ever. But if you picture like the standard like tomato pin cushion, it's just like free flying. You set it on your table or whatever. And then there's also magnetic pin cushions that are like a tray magnet. And so if you have like pins laying out on a counter, if you like run your magnet pin cushion like over the counter, it picks them all up. I know some people love their magnetic pin cushions, so it's probably just a preference thing. For me personally, like I never really have pins laying out on the counter. Maybe that's because I have a cushion for them. And I know you can also get like a magnetic bracelet one. So there are a lot of different options. An actual cushion on a bracelet is my recommendation, and that's the one that I have linked, but I do think you need some sort of something to stick your pins in. Next thing you need is scissors. So I personally think that it's necessary, like 95% necessary, to have big scissors and snips. I use both of these all the time. If you absolutely only want to get one, you could just get big scissors. I feel like you probably need those more. And basically what I use my big scissors for is, you know, cutting big pieces of fabric, just making those like bigger cuts. You certainly do use those a lot, but I probably use my snips more frequently. Although if I had to pick one, you can't really do with your snips what you can do with your bigger scissors, but you can technically do a lot of what I do with these, if that makes sense. But my favorite of the two is the smaller one. Hopefully that isn't confusing. But essentially essentially what I use my snips for is I snip all my threads off, even though my machine does have like, it has like this little like hook thing that you can snip your threads off with. I never use it. I just use these because I feel like they get closer into the fabric. Like they're very like precise. So they get super close to the thread. And also if you have to like cut in like small narrow spaces, this having like little teeny snips is really, really helpful. Also ones that are like spring loaded, is that the term? I've used a lot of little snippers because these ones get like used more often and kind of like my kids throw them around and whatever. So I've used a lot of kinds and I feel like the ones with the springs are very nice to have. And they lock in place too. So this is like locked closed and then you just slide it up and it's open. I also have these ones that I've used. They like slide open like that and they're just little snippers. I don't like these ones as much though. I like the more like, I don't know, narrow snips. Anyways, I tried a lot of different kinds. These ones are my favorite. This exact small scissor thing wasn't on Amazon, but I've linked the closest thing to it, which that one I have also had and used. Honestly, I feel like I just lose these in moves. I don't know. I've had so many different kinds of like little teeny scissors. So the big ones are like $9 on Amazon right now. And these ones are closer. I think like 19 or 20 because they're a little bit fancier. I would get both, but again, if you're only getting one, just get big ones. And then as far as cutting actual fabric of like your cutting pattern pieces or whatever, my personal favorite way to do that is not with scissors, but with a rotary cutter. So this is what a rotary cutter is. If you've never used it before, it's basically like a pizza cutter, but for fabric. So you just push this handle in and the blade like pops out so that you can run this along a cutting mat and cut fabric. I have always cut with this because the very first thing I made was a quilt and I thought that like the way you cut quilting pieces was with a rotary cutter. So I have always used this. And this is the very first rotary cutter I also had. I love this brand. The blades are super sharp, last forever. There are like replacement blades that you have to buy. And I sew constantly, and I'd say I only replace my blade every like maybe 6 months. So it's really not that often. I think if you don't sew super often, you'd be good for quite a while. So to use a rotary cutter, you obviously need the actual rotary cutter. A blade, you can get replacement blades, those are linked. But then you also need a cutting mat. Mine is on my table back here, but I've linked both the cutting mat that I have now and the one that I used for years and years and years. I do have opinions about cutting mats because if you just go like Google or look on Amazon at cutting mats, there will be a lot of ones that come up. I'd say you definitely need one that says self-healing. That will just get ripped up less often. And it isn't like an actual miracle. Like when you cut using a rotary cutter, like it does leave little lines on your cutting mat. The self-healing ones just don't get as damaged, but it's not like you cut a line into it and then the next morning you wake up and there's no lines. It's not necessarily like that. They just last way longer. But then there's also some on there that are like $8 and they say they're self-healing. Don't get those. I have used like crappy cutting mats before and they just need to be replaced within like weeks. I just feel like it's a waste of money. So the two that I've linked, the one that I used forever is the green one. It's like A1 size, which is 24 by 36 inches. I would not get anything smaller than that. I think 24 by 36 will fit on most like tables, which cutting on dining room tables has been the story of my life up until what, like 4 months ago when I built my studio. And then now I have like a giant cutting table. So 24 by 36 is a good size that it'll fit on most tables, or if you want to cut on the floor, some people cut on the floor, but it's not too big, right? Like it's not going to not fit on a table. But if you go any smaller, like there are cutting mats you can get that are like 12 by 18 inches, but like just think about the clothes you wear. Like what pair of pants are you going to be able to cut on 12 inches, like a foot at a time? You're going to have to keep like sliding your fabric along. I would not get anything smaller than 24 by 36. Oh, and also the one that I have recommended, it has two sides to it as well. So once one side does get pretty thrashed, which, you know, it will happen, but probably after like years, to be honest. So after years of one side getting kind of thrashed, then you can flip it around to the other side, or you can kind of rotate every other, and yeah, it should last a super long time. And then the one that I have now is 36 by 48. which is like way huge. It basically fits my giant table and I love it and I would definitely recommend it, but it probably isn't going to fit on like most dining room tables. So if you have a giant cutting space or you have a giant floor area to cut from, I would recommend the one that I have, but you don't need to get the insanely huge one. And then the one other tool you need for cutting. So to cut, you need your rotary cutter, your cutting mat, and a straight edge. So this is just like a hard piece of plastic. It's just like a big giant ruler. Mine is 6 by 24. And again, I would not get one smaller than this. I do have a smaller one. This one is 4 by 14. I use this very, very rarely because anything I can do with this one, I can do with this one. I think I got this one first and then I upgraded to this one, but I don't know, I hang on to it. It just sort of sits in my drawer and I kind of forget about it. But this one I feel like I use all the time. So basically when you're cutting anything, you have your mat, you like lay your straight edge on there and then you like cut right along the edge of the straight edge so it keeps your lines like super duper straight. But then obviously rotary cutters are also amazing for cutting around curves. Like you don't need the straight edge for curved things, right? Like if you're cutting around a pattern. But if you're cutting out like a rectangle or something to measure on the grid of your cutting mat, I feel like this is necessary. And it's just like cutting pizza basically. You need to like apply pressure down and then forward. If you just kind of like lightly let the rotary cutter glide over the fabric, it's not gonna cut anything. You just press down and then let it rip. So I'm sure there are a lot of people who just cut into their fabric with scissors. You absolutely could do that. I just feel like it's so much more difficult. My rotary cutter is like the love of my life. You will also need some kind of measuring tape. This is just like a retractable measuring tape. Inches are on one side, centimeters are on the other. This one I actually got from my grandma when she passed away. So it is definitely used looking, but I am never going to replace it if I can help it. But the one I've linked on Amazon is basically the same thing. And between this measuring tape that's just like a soft measuring tape that you can use around your body or whatever, and my straight edge, which I use to measure all the time, I think you're good on measuring things. Another thing that you definitely will need is an iron. So in my personal opinion, if you're just starting out and you don't already have an iron, because you may already have one, a lot of people have irons. If you don't have one and you need one, I don't think that you need a super nice one to start out with. The one I've linked, I will say, is probably not a nice one. Like that's not how I describe it, but it'll do the job. It'll be fine. And then once you have caught the sewing bug and you're like obsessed with it and you sew all the time, you probably would want to upgrade it, but more in the long run. Also, I've used a lot of irons and the cheap ones, like the one I linked, will, if you're sewing all the time, it probably is going to die on you in like maybe a year or so. But if you don't use it constantly, like I would never tell you to buy something that I know is going to die on you in a year. If you're just using it like a normal frequency, like you guys, I cannot emphasize how much I sew. I sew basically every day for several hours, and I know that's not normal. So for someone like me, that iron is going to die in a year. But if you just sew occasionally, you'll probably be fine. But again, if you want one that's a little bit nicer and you're looking to upgrade, or maybe you are psychotic like me and you do sew as much as me, in that case, my favorite iron, hands down, that I've ever had is my cordless iron. Let me show it to you. This feels like QVC, but I'm so obsessed with it. So this is my iron. It has its little bed that it sits in, and you plug in the bed, probably a better word for that. And then the actual iron comes out. So this is what heats the iron. It's like, it has like a little plug thing here you can see that it sits down on. And so it heats it while it's sitting in here. And then once you take it off, you can iron things. It stays hot for quite a while. You do have to like keep putting it back in the tray between like you shifting your fabric around, right? Like you pick the iron up, you iron for a little bit, you set it back in the tray, shift your fabric around, adjust it, then you pick up your iron and do it again. So I feel like it was like a slight learning curve just to remember to set it back in the tray instead of just like off to the side like you would with a normal iron. But once you get used to it, it's super easy and it's like second nature now. So highly recommend this. It is the best thing in the world. You would think a cord wouldn't make that much difference, but I was tripping on my cord all the time for like a decade. And I just got this a few months ago and I had been thinking about it forever, like years. And I always thought, oh, I probably don't need it, but gosh, I wish I had done it sooner. So that is a nice to have thing. You need to have an iron of some sort. A cordless one is a nice to have thing. And then of course you would need an ironing board. Mine's just like a normal, I think I got mine at Target. You probably maybe already have an ironing board. If you don't have one, you don't need a super nice one. Again, I think I just got mine at Target. It's like the standard size of an ironing board. You can get some that are like tabletop ironing boards. And I feel like that would probably work if you have like a small space you're working in. You could definitely get a small ironing board, and that might just be something that once you are addicted, then you can upgrade it, but you'll need some sort of surface to iron on. Okay, there's just a few more things. Chalk or like tailor's pens are a thing that you will need to use. However, I think I have a sort of controversial take on this. So when you're sewing things, especially with patterns and whatnot, there may be like certain markings you need to make while sewing. Personally, I don't even mark my things up a ton, depending on the project, but I would say most projects I use, I don't end up marking on the fabric all the time. It's not like, oh, I 100% mark everything I'm doing. When I do mark things, for the majority of my sewing experience, I just use like pencils, or honestly, if it's in a place that's not going to be shown, I'll just like lightly use a pen. And I know that it's not always like washable and whatever. To me, it's just like, if you don't see it, it's fine. I just kind of like grab whatever's around. Sometimes it's like my kids' colored pencils. So I feel like you don't need like tailor's chalk. I've literally never used it. I think it came in like the kit that I got when I was starting, and I have never used it. I feel like you can use pencils or whatnot. However, since doing more like quilted garments or even like darts, I feel like darts in clothing, there's no dart here, but a lot of like tops and dresses will have darts in the pattern. For those types of things, I have found a tool that I love and I am obsessed with that marks your fabric, but it doesn't actually leave any ink or anything. So this is called a Hera marker, and it's literally just a piece of plastic. Like, it's not made up of chalk or anything, and it just comes to a really, really fine edge here. It's kind of like a boning knife, is that what they're called? And maybe you could use that as well. Or some people say they even use like their kitchen knives, like the butter knives, not like a steak knife. But basically what it does is you run it over your fabric, kind of like a rotary cutter, like you push down, but it doesn't cut your fabric. It just leaves like a crease, like it leaves a line in your fabric that honestly like it's very visible and it stays for a while. Like it leaves like a really, really nice crease in your fabric, and it obviously irons and washes out because there's no ink or chalk, it's just a line. So I freaking love my Hera marker. Now that I've discovered this tool, I do use it quite frequently, and I think it's like, gosh, I should have looked it up. Actually, I think it's it's like $6 or $7. They're pretty cheap. Anyway, obsessed with it. You probably need some way to mark your fabric, so you can either just use pencils or you can get this, which I love. These last two things are firmly in the nice to have category, but they are very nice to have, just not necessary. First off is this ruler, which is a hot ruler. So it's made out of this like really thin, flimsy plastic that is meant to be ironed on. So I use this mostly for hems. So basically when you're folding up fabric for any sort of hem, you want to keep it a consistent width, right? Like you want to fold it up half of an inch or an inch or 4 inches or whatever, however deep you want it. And oftentimes I eyeball it, or sometimes you can like measure along certain points, but it's kind of just inconsistent and difficult. So this makes your life so much easier because you can fold your hem up very consistently, iron straight on top of this and on top of your fabric, and it makes your hems like nice and crisp. So I've actually only been using this for a few weeks, but I use it constantly, and it's another one of those things that's very inexpensive and has changed my life. So there's a hot ruler. And then the last thing is a bias tape maker. So I use a lot of bias tape in the things I make. If you don't know what bias tape is, it's essentially a thin strip of fabric that is cut on the bias. We'll get into that in the fabric video, but on the bias means it's cut at a diagonal angle. For woven fabrics, the grain and cross grain don't like have stretch to them, right? They're not like stretchy fabrics. It's like linens or like quilting cottons. They aren't stretchy, but on the diagonal, if you pull your fabric at a diagonal, there is a little bit of give and a little bit of stretch to it. So for certain elements of garments, like for what I'm wearing. This binding here is bias tape because it's cut on the bias, and so it's able to go around this curve really well because it has that little bit of give to it. So the straps and this neckline here are bias tape, and I use a lot of bias tape. It's a way to bind your raw edges, right? Because if there was no bias tape here, this would just be like the raw edge of my fabric, it would be fraying, whatever. So I use bias tape all the time. Some people don't really love it or are scared of it or whatever. You can also buy pre-made bias tape, but I personally just don't really like that. It's always like stiff and I don't know. I prefer to make my own bias tape out of like the actual fabric that I'm sewing with. So that's what bias tape is. Sorry, long explanation to explain what a bias tape maker is. So this little metal tool feeds the strip of bias fabric into this end, and then it spits it out folded like bias tape so that you can just iron it. Otherwise, you need to just fold all your bias tape on its own, which I've done for 10 years and it certainly works. It just kind of takes a while. So again, this isn't necessary. You don't absolutely need it, but it is very nice, especially if you do use bias tape a lot. And the one I've linked comes in a bunch of different sizes, so you can make like really teeny tiny bias tape, which I honestly don't really use. Like this one, the blue one, I think the 25 refers to like millimeters, but this one makes 1/2 inch bias tape, which is like what's on my dress here. And this is really the only size that I've used. So anyway, bias tape maker is another great, nice to have tool. I think that covers every tool that I use on a regular basis. And again, everything is linked in the description, or you can just go to like my Amazon storefront and everything's listed out there as well. And like I said, you do not have to buy everything on Amazon. A lot of these things you can buy from like local fabric stores. So in the next Learning to Sew video, we are going to be talking about fabric, which I feel like I get the most questions about fabric than any other topic. So I'm very excited about that one. I think it will be a great resource. And then, like I said, after that, I'll be doing a video on how to use your machine. So all of the things we talked about today, if they were gibberish to you about sewing machines, we're gonna walk through all of that stuff, including Sergers. And then we'll do a little project together, which will probably be a tote bag, something very simple. And then I think I may do like a final, like if I get a lot of questions, like kind of miscellaneous questions in the comments on these, I'll do like a final Q&A. And you can ask anything. Like I said, it could be miscellaneous stuff. So if you have random questions that pop up about things that I'm talking about, or just about like, I don't know, my sewing journey or whatever, I'll probably do a final Q&A as my last video. I also wanted to shout out, if you are needing more sewing friends, like if you don't know other people who sew really and you want to talk to other people about like the things you're making and like show things off or ask questions or whatever, I have a group on Discord that's basically just a group of a lot of beginners mostly, or just like people who sew and want to talk to other people about sewing. It's a lot of people showing off, you know, the recent stuff they made. There's like different channels for like a place to ask questions about fabric, a place to ask for pattern recommendations, a place to ask questions about things your machine is doing. It's been a really great group so far. It's very low-key, very chill. I was hesitant when I created the group because I really didn't want it to be like, right, like a dramatic internet group, which is why I didn't put it on Facebook. But it's been really good. Everyone's like super nice. So if you just need sewing friends, I'll put a link for that. It's called the Sewing Besties group on Discord, and you need the link to access it. You can't just like search it. So I'll put the link in the description if that sounds like something you'd like to join. Okay, awesome. I am proud of you guys. Again, if you are like a beginner learning how to sew, I just love you so much and I'm so excited for all the cute stuff you're gonna make. And if you're feeling overwhelmed already, I promise you will be fine. I think at its core, sewing is so much easier than people make it out to be. So even though we have just dipped our toe into the sewing world today and there are so many more things that we need to talk about, you will be totally fine. Love you guys, and meet me back here for a chat about fabric.